Right. Hello, Epidemics. I hope everybody's doing well today. So we have our first essay due this week. So that's the only assignment for this week. Read the prompt. Make sure that you spend some time thinking about the topic and try and write a well-considered essay of a reasonable length. I give you the amount of information that I want in the instructions for the essay. But please be considerate and spend some time on that. I also want to remind you guys, project requests are going to be due on Friday, March 3rd. So that's a little more than two and a half weeks from now. So if you haven't given much thought to the project, let me know, or spend some time thinking about it. The project is the goal of the project is for you to research a pandemic or epidemic situation that we don't talk about in class, and then communicate that information. Make sure it's organized and clearly communicated in some format. So format can be paper, that's fine, but you can also do various other kinds of formats. You can do a presentation. I've had students do TikTok videos. I've had students do graphic novels. So there's a lot of different ways you can present your information. Okay, are there any questions on the essay or the project?
So for the essay, we choose one of the prompts, right?
Yes, just one of the prompts. Yeah. So if you haven't looked at it yet, you have a choice of what you talk about. Anything else? All right. So we wrapped up HIV/AIDS last time. Now we're going to go further back in time, and we're going to talk about a disease called smallpox. There are going to be some graphic images in this material. It's all skin related, so there's not going to be like internal organs or anything like that, but they do look kind of gross. So I'm going to read you a quote from a book called The Demon in the Freezer by Richard Preston that kind of describes the disease itself. The red areas spread into blotches across the face and arms, and within hours, the blotches broke out into seas of tiny pimples. They were sharp feeling, not itchy, and by nightfall, they covered the face, arms, hands, and feet. Pimples were rising out of the soles of the feet and on the palms of the hands too. During the night, the pimples developed tiny blistered heads, and the heads continued to grow larger, rising all over the body at the same speed, like a field of barley sprouting after the rain. They hurt dreadfully, and they were enlarging into boils. They had a waxy, hard look, and they seemed unripe. Fever soared abruptly and began to rage. The rubbing of pajamas on the skin felt like a roasting fire. By dawn, the body had become a mass of knob-like blisters. They were everywhere, all over, but clustered most thickly on the face and extremities. The insides of the mouth and ear canals and sinuses had pustulated. It felt as if the skin was pulling off of the body, that it would split and rupture. The blisters were hard and dry, and they didn't leak. They were like ball bearings embedded in the skin with a soft, velvety feel on the surface. Each pustule had a dimple in the center. They were pressurized with an opalescent pus. The pustules began to touch one another, and finally they merged into confluent shapes that covered the body like a cobblestone street. The skin was torn away across the body, and the pustules on the face combined into a bubbled mass filled with fluid until the skin of the face essentially detached from its underlayers and became a bag surrounding the tissues of the head. Tongue, gums, and hard palate were studded with pustules, the mouth dry. The virus had stripped the skin off the body, both inside and out, and the pain seemed almost beyond the capacity of human nature to endure. So, smallpox was a very, very nasty disease. This description was one of the more severe cases, but it gives you an idea of what we're going to be talking about here. And it's important to realize that the pustules that formed all over the surface of the body also form on some internal organs. So it's not limited to the outside of the body. So smallpox is caused by a virus. We defined virus in our last unit when we talked about HIV. Viruses are not bacteria. This is a red blood cell on the left. This is an E. coli bacteria. So you can see there's a good size difference between single red blood cells and bacteria. Bacteria are quite a bit smaller. But if we go down here to these last three, these are viruses. And you can see that compared to the bacteria, they are tiny. They are so small that you cannot use light to image them because they're smaller than a wavelength of light. You literally have to use electrons to image viruses. Antibiotics work against bacteria, but not viruses. Every living thing has some viruses that can infect it. They can infect bacteria, animals, plants, fungi, you name it. If it's a living organism, it can be infected with viruses. And there are millions of different types of those. On the other hand, bacteria are unicellular organisms that are clearly alive. They have DNA, they have cellular machinery, they make proteins, they reproduce, which is why viruses can infect them. Because remember, the virus hijacks a host cell in order to make more copies of itself. The term virus originally meant something that caused disease. It wasn't clearly defined. This was back in ancient Greek and Roman times, and people didn't really understand the disease process. In my notes, I say it was similar to miasma. So miasma literally means bad air. And it was kind of the first concept, the earliest concept of what causes disease. We'll talk about these early concepts of what caused disease when we get to the Black Death, because that was further back in time. So we've got, we'll talk about the origin of these ideas. When people started developing microscopes and started seeing bacteria, they thought, well, that's a virus. It's a type of virus. And of course, now we separate them out because they are very, very different from each other. When we look at viruses, some viruses are generalists, and they can infect a wide range of species. Generally, viruses that infect mammals can spread between different mammals if they're generalists. There are a few that can go between, say, birds and humans, or reptiles and humans. I do not know of any that can spread between us and fish, or insects, or plants. When we have a disease that can spread between different organisms, we call that zoonotic. By definition, zoonotic diseases are generalists. Other diseases are very species specific. These diseases can mutate, and when they mutate, they might gain the ability to spill over from their species into another species. We saw this with HIV. We know this is the case with COVID. So that is one of the major sources of new epidemics, is when a disease that infects other types of animals mutates and spills over into us. Now, things like influenza can sometimes spread between humans and birds, or between humans and pigs, or birds and pigs. So there's this little triangle of species that tend to swap flu viruses around. And this is why we have to have a new flu virus every year, or at least part of the story there. Right now, you may have heard there is a strain of flu called H5N1. When we talk about the 1918 flu pandemic, I'll explain in detail what that means. It has to do with the virus's ability to infect cells. And H5N1 usually infects birds. The strain that's been going around this winter has been particularly deadly. Lots of bird deaths. You may have noticed the price of eggs going up. That's because chickens have been infected with this strain of flu. They're dying in large numbers. Farmers are culling flocks. Basically, they're killing off all their chickens to try and prevent the flu from spreading to other barns full of chickens, or chicken houses full of chickens, so that they don't lose everything they have. Unfortunately, H5N1 has been seen to spread into mammals in a couple of different locations around the world. So it's something to keep an eye on and something to be very aware of. It's not an epidemic in humans. I don't think there have been any confirmed cases of H5N1 in people this year. We'll have to wait and see. Okay. All right, I warned you there would be some unpleasant pictures. These people are both suffering from smallpox. The photo on the left was in the early 1900s. The photo on the right, this poor child was one of the last people to get smallpox. She was in Bangladesh during one of the last significant outbreaks of smallpox. Smallpox is not related to chickenpox. It has nothing to do with chickenpox. Smallpox is caused by two different viruses, variola major and variola minor. These are both what we call pox viruses. Pox viruses are very, very common in lots and lots of different animals. Pretty much any species of vertebrate has a pox virus that they can get. Reptiles, birds, fish, dolphins, crocodiles, mammals, we all get pox viruses. There are even some invertebrates that have pox viruses. In general, pox viruses will either stay within a species or within closely related species, although avian pox tends to spread throughout all kinds of birds. This is not related to chickenpox. Chickenpox is a herpes virus. It's only called a pox because it causes, raised lesions on the skin. What smallpox is related to is a disease called cowpox. Cowpox causes a mild disease in cows. It can spread from cows to humans. And if humans get infected with cowpox, yeah, they have some minor symptoms. But what's interesting here they then have some immunity, some resistance to smallpox. So if you've been exposed to cowpox, you are less likely to get smallpox. And if you do get smallpox, you're likely to have a milder case. Put a pin in that concept right there. The variola major and minor only infect humans. There is no reservoir, there is no vector. It is spread from human to human. New terms here, reservoir. A reservoir is an animal species that can be infected with a disease and periodically can spread the disease into humans. So when we get to the plague, we'll talk about rodents being a reservoir species for plague. Plague, which caused the Black Death, still exists. It exists in a lot of ground squirrels and related species of rodent. We think there's a reservoir species for Ebola, but nobody's found it yet. But Ebola disappears from the human population and then reappears, often not even in the same area. So we think that there's an animal that has Ebola, that survives it, and it spills over into humans. When we talk about reservoir species, the reservoir may or may not be sickened by the virus or bacteria. So they might not get sick from it. They may just kind of carry it around, or they may just get something similar to a common cold. So it's kind of a place where the virus or the bacteria can continue to survive, but when it gets into people, it causes disease. So that's reservoir. Write that word down. The other word is vector. So a vector is usually an arthropod. And when I say arthropod, we're talking about things like insects, like mosquitoes, or closely related things like ticks and fleas. And a vector can spread diseases between individuals or between species. So malaria is spread by the mosquito vector. Malaria, a mosquito that is capable of transmitting malaria bites an infected person, then goes and bites somebody who's not infected and gives them the malaria parasite. Lyme disease is spread by tick vectors. Ticks bite a mouse or a deer or a person with Lyme disease, and then they bite you and you get Lyme disease. The vector may or may not be affected by the virus, bacteria, or parasite. In the case of malaria, we know that the mosquito does have some, the parasite does affect the behavior and the lifespan of the mosquito. So it does sicken the mosquito to some degree. All right, the fact that only humans can get infected with smallpox. The fact that cowpox, a related virus, provides some immunity to humans. And the fact that there is no reservoir or vaccine for smallpox allowed us to eradicate this virus in the early 1970s. This virus only exists in a couple of freezers. It's not out there in the world. You are not going to get smallpox, barring bioterrorism. So the CDC has some. We know that Russia has some. We suspect that, you know, China might have some, but we don't know for sure. But all of the known samples are just, you know, they're in a freezer somewhere and nobody's really doing anything with them. Which is good, because I don't know about you, but I don't want to see children this badly infected, or adults. So since I was just mentioning that the only place smallpox exists, I'm gonna, let's see, I'm gonna send you guys into a breakout group for a few minutes. You're going to be in 2 breakout groups, and I want you to spend some time discussing the fact that the United States and Russia both have smallpox samples in the freezer. And every few years, there's a discussion about whether or not the US or the US and Russia should destroy the samples. So I want you to talk about it in your groups and see if you can see why it might be a good thing to destroy them and why it might be a good thing to not destroy them. And see if you can come up with an opinion which way you would go. And I'm going to give you about 5 minutes. back to the group. Wrap up what you've been talking about. I'm closing the rooms. All right, looks like everybody's back. So what'd you think? Should we destroy the last smallpox samples?
So our group said that we should definitely keep them, and that's because to definitely study them, and like especially with the development of like new vaccines and stuff like that would be a good research tool,
Mhm.
you know, to look at smallpox and look at, you know, how that's been treated. And but yeah, like, and we also said too that if it was to be held on to and like eventually like get out, like someone took it, or there was another outbreak, like the vaccines are so effective for it that it would be, you know, it wouldn't be this large, you know, outbreak. It would be a very small, you know, contained thing. So
Okay, good. What about the other group?
Well, I've actually just raised something that I was thinking based on what Sam was saying. You can very easily alter viruses to be bacteria resistant, such as COVID. Sort of different variants were less affected by the initial vaccine, which is why boosters had to come out.
Mhm.
So imagine if somebody intentionally altered a disease like that, vaccines might not be as effective. And hypothetically, if we could make sure that both samples were entirely destroyed so that US and Russia did not have them 100% certain, I think that'd be playing it safe.
Okay, good. Any other opinions?
No, I agree with that.
Okay. So personally, I'm in favor of destroying them, but I do not believe that either the US or Russia would destroy all of their samples. I just don't believe that they would do that. They might say they do it, but I don't believe it would happen. You're right, we can, to some degree, genetically manipulate viruses. We don't generally have a good enough handle at the current point, a good enough understanding at the current point in time to be able to look at the genome of smallpox and say, if we change this, it'll be resistant to, the vaccine won't work against it anymore. We don't really know that. We don't know what all the genes do. Probably at some point in the future, we can figure that out. If somebody did mutate smallpox and release it, we would want to get samples of the new virus to figure out how to deal with it. Because the old virus is the old virus. It's like if we went back and we looked at the original COVID virus and we tried to use that to figure out how to treat these Omicron variants. It wouldn't necessarily work. But yeah, it's a very hotly debated topic, and nobody can quite come up with a good final decision on that one. Okay.
I just don't see what they would need it for if it's completely eradicated. Like what could they do with that research?
Yeah. you wouldn't actually want to do a lot of research on it because there's always a risk of it escaping again, right? So yeah, I'm right there with you. Okay, good. So where did smallpox come from? It only infects people. It had to come from somewhere. Smallpox, we believe, has been circulating in people, it's been infecting people for at least 5,000 years. So in the grand scheme of our evolution, that's not that long ago. So it's not really an ancient virus or an ancient disease. Like malaria is an ancient disease. Figuring out where that came from, it probably evolved, you know, sometime while the dinosaurs were roaming the planet, maybe even before that. Smallpox is not that old. We think it originated in Africa. So 5,000 years ago, possibly Africa. The reason why we think Africa is because we can look at Egyptian mummies. So this is Pharaoh Ramses V. He died in 1145 before the Common Era, also known as BC. And you can see these pock marks on his face. These are smallpox, either pustules if he died with it or they're scars from it. But it's definitely a mark of smallpox. We have no evidence that smallpox was in Asia or in Europe at this time period. And we know for a fact that it was not in the Americas during this time period. We're going to come back to that one. So there was movement in the ancient world between Egypt and Europe and stuff, but smallpox didn't really start to spread into Europe until the Crusades. So the Crusades were religious wars. European Christians started funding or participating in military expeditions to the Middle East, what they considered the Holy Lands. They were going to these areas to capture holy sites from the Muslims who lived there. So Jerusalem was a big target. We have to take Jerusalem back from the Muslims. They were also going after pagans and heretics. So, oh, if you're not a Christian, we can kill you, no problem. It's a war. It's a Christian war. So the First Crusade started in about 1095 and continued on and off until about 1270. So, you know, a couple of hundred years there. The end date is kind of vague because we have scattered conflicts after that time period. So we know that when the Crusades came back from the Middle East, they brought smallpox with them. So they started spreading it in high numbers throughout Europe. I don't have, as usual, good data about when it started showing up in Asia. I don't have good data pretty much for any of these diseases, except for the Black Death in Asia. But we do have knowledge of when smallpox moved into the Americas. There's no evidence of smallpox in the Americas before Columbus. This suggests that smallpox evolved into the ability to infect humans after humans populated the Americas. So humans moved into North and South America about 20,000 years ago. So that kind of gives us an oldest possible time frame. And we know it was at least 5,000 years old because we have bodies that we can look at. So it's a range of, 5 to 20,000 years ago. It's not a small range, but it does give us boundaries to that. We believe that smallpox came from a rodent pox. And we think that it probably moved into humans about the time of the development of agriculture. Lots of modern day diseases seem to have moved into people about the time we developed agriculture, which was around 10,000 years ago. Why did all of these diseases start becoming a problem when we developed agriculture? Well, smallpox in particular requires a relatively large population in order to persist. Before agriculture, communities were small, probably too small to support smallpox. There wasn't a lot of long distance travel. You might interact with nearby communities, trading members to keep, genetic diversity and that kind of stuff. But around the time agriculture came along, we started being able to fund cities. And once we started funding cities, we started having a lot more people living in a common area. And we started having trade routes. So we think that's some of the important things that were going on that caused smallpox to move into us. Not to mention the fact that with the development of agriculture, humans and rodents, mice and rats particularly, really started interacting together a lot more than in the past. So we talked about bats. We're also going to see a lot of rodent diseases that jump into humans. Rodents make up about 50% of animal species. So they tend to be very numerous and they tend to do very well, and they live in close proximity to humans. So that really helps the spread back and forth of these zoonotic diseases. These images here are from Mesoamerica. So this is when smallpox moved through the Aztec Empire. And these were drawn by Bernardo de, I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name. Yeah, I'm not even going to try that. A 16th century Spanish Franciscan missionary. Smallpox really did a number on the Native Americans. So when we talk about this disease and why it was so horrific, about 50% of people who are exposed got the disease. So if you were exposed to smallpox, there was a 50-50 chance that you would get smallpox. People who have smallpox are infectious for several weeks. Starting with the first symptoms, ending when the last scab from one of these blisters falls off. That scab itself can be infectious for 2 to 4 months So you may not be infectious, but if you've got the scab in your bedding or in your clothing, that scab can spread the disease for another 2 to 4 months. It's spread by inhalation. So you exhale droplets, you sneeze, you cough on a sick, on somebody, and if they're within 6 feet of you, that's an exposure. Now, the good news is these droplets, these coughed, sneezed, or exhaled droplets do not survive for very long. The virus outside of the body, outside of these scabs, is relatively fragile, kind of picky about the conditions. So it requires certain conditions in order to stay infective once it's out of the body. Now, the scabs can protect the virus. So the good news is no scabs, just liquid droplets, easy to clean up. We also get what's called vertical transmission or congenital smallpox. Vertical transmission is from a mother to her unborn child. So kids can get smallpox in the womb or be born with it. Larger particles, which are called fomites, and the scabs themselves can adhere to objects like cooking utensils, clothing, and blankets, and these can last for quite a bit longer than just the droplets that we expel when we're breathing or sneezing or coughing. As we're seeing over and over, the conditions that encourage the spread of smallpox include crowded conditions, with smallpox specifically sharing linens. So if you went to a roadside inn and the person who spent the night there last night had smallpox and the linens were not removed and cleaned, which, that might not have happened, you were likely to get the disease. And during the early times of smallpox, a lot of people would sell used linens and used clothing. People still do that to some degree, but nowadays we clean everything. We wash it in the washing machine, run it through the dryer. Back in these days, we didn't have that technology. So shared or donated or sold linens and clothing might not have been cleaned before you got it. Migrations or movement of peoples. The Crusades here were an example of movements of large numbers of people. We also see warfare and colonization. So warfare, again, the Crusades, colonization was moving it to the Americas. By the 17th century, this was a very common disease in Europe, and it was predominantly in children. If you survived it in childhood, you were not likely to get it again. And during this time period, 1 out of every 3 childhood deaths was due to smallpox. I haven't told you the mortality rate. The case fatality rate, CFR. Case fatality rate means how many people who get the disease will die from that disease. And for smallpox, the case fatality rate is around 30 to 40%. So let's think about this. If smallpox moved into your village, about half of people in your village would get the disease, and 30 to 40% of those would die from it. That's not a small percentage of your community. That's more than 10%. That's like 15 or more percent who would die from this one particular outbreak. So that's huge. In general, the terms that were used to describe the symptoms of smallpox were things like, it's the worst of all human maladies. It is a grotesque torture. You heard the description at the beginning. It generally lasts for a month. And you get, during that month, fever, nausea, severe backache and headache, convulsions, not to mention the pain of the pustules, both on the outside of the skin and inside the body. So it's very, very painful. Survivors had permanent scarring from the disease. So the scars would last for the rest of their lives. So in general, when we talk about this disease, when we talk about the course of the infection, there's an incubation period of around 12 days. So this means you're exposed and 12 days later, you start showing symptoms, almost 2 weeks. And when the symptoms come on, you get the fever, you get the body aches, you are literally too sick to work, too sick to cook your own food, basically too sick to do anything. So the very ill portion lasts 2 to 4 days. And that's your fever primarily. Then the rash shows up. And as we heard at the beginning, these usually start on the face and in the mouth. They also show up on the extremities, the hands, the arms, the leg. And these pustules that you see here on this poor person are full of virions. Virion is a virus particle, an individual virus. So that's what's in these. These are full of virus. And these things grow and they start hurting and they're painful. People start having difficulty swallowing, difficulty speaking because of the lesions in their mouth. They become larger, raised. Eventually, they form these very distinctive circular lesions with that dip in the middle, almost like a donut under the skin. That is very characteristic of smallpox. They start to spread together and become what we call confluent. So you can see on the arm over here, these pustules have all grown together and it's hard to tell, especially here in the middle, where one ends and the next one begins. Then they burst and they start to scab over. And when they burst, they smell bad. These scabs that form over the burst pustules are also full of virus, and they are contagious for a long, long time period. Once the scabs fall off, the skin is relatively raw, and you can get secondary infections of the skin at that point. Things like Staphylococcus infections of the skin, which can also be life-threatening and very nasty. So this is the common course of smallpox. There are a couple of different forms that it comes in. There's a severe form. This is not the severe form. This is the normal course of smallpox. The severe form, the fever lasts longer. The lesions don't grow as fast or as large. But the more severe form is nearly always fatal. There's also a hemorrhagic form. Hemorrhagic means bleeding. So your skin would bleed, your blood vessels would leak inside the body. So you'd be bleeding internally as well as externally. This was not very common, but again, it was almost always fatal. If you survived smallpox, there was a long recovery period. Those pox marks would cause permanent damage, including scars. You could become blind. Yeah, you could get smallpox pox on your eye that would blind you. You might have neurological damage. You could have damage to the intestines, the heart, the lungs, other internal organs. So you might be permanently disabled. I don't have you a good number for what percentage were permanently disabled, just because nobody was keeping track of that kind of thing back when smallpox was raging. But if you recovered and you survived, you would not get smallpox again. Okay. So this is just the numbers again. Approximately 50% of exposed people got infected. If you show symptoms, there was about a 30% risk of death, 1 out of 3. It is estimated that during the time period when smallpox was raging in Europe, it caused about 10% of all deaths in Europe. And the total mortality is estimated to be over 500 million. The population of the US right now is somewhere around 325 million. It's somewhere in the 320s. So, nasty, nasty disease. In the 20th century, remember, we eradicated it during this time period. But between 1900 to 1978, there were over 300 million deaths from smallpox. So just during that one century, last century. And we have, this number is pretty good. This 300 million deaths is pretty good. That's almost the current population of the US. The total mortality over the time, this is probably an underestimate. But population has gone up dramatically since the 1900s, since 1900. So that's why over half of the estimated deaths did occur in the 19th century, because the population really was growing that fast. This is Thomas Macaulay, and he's describing the comparison between plague and smallpox. That disease was then the most terrible of all the ministers of death. The havoc of the plague had been far more rapid, but the plague had visited once or twice, and smallpox was always present, tormenting with constant fears all whom it had not yet stricken, leaving on those whose lives it spared the hideous traces of its power, turning the babe into a changeling at which the mother shuddered, and making the eyes and cheeks of the betrothed maiden objects of horror to her lover. So the scarring could be significant, and the response from society was literally horror. Women who did not have scars were more likely to get married. They were more likely to marry well. A lot of women who had scars on her face were less likely to get married. And during a lot of this time period, it's not like today where women can just have a job and you don't need to get married. During this time period, it was harder for women to work, and it was a lot more important for her to be married so that somebody would, feed her and clothe her and shelter her. So smallpox kind of followed the initial surge of the plague. The Black Death came first, and then smallpox. And during the 17th and 18th centuries, smallpox became much more widespread. This is probably related to population growth. Because remember, smallpox needs a decent, because it can only infect you once, it needs a good size population in order to continue surviving and spreading. So this disease would get passed around a community or a cluster of communities. The adults would be the survivors. And then smallpox would disappear for a while. But the new children who had not been exposed, when their numbers got high enough, then you would have another outbreak. You would need enough new children to start another outbreak. So the adults had something called herd immunity. So herd immunity is this concept where if a large percentage of a population is immune to a disease, that disease is less likely to show up in that community and to spread within that community. So basically, if we have all of these hearts are people who are immune to smallpox. These stars are people who are vulnerable to smallpox. So if somebody comes in from outside with smallpox, comes into this community, the likelihood that this person will interact with these two other people who are vulnerable is less than the likelihood that they'll interact with people who are resistant. So the people who are resistant help protect those who are vulnerable simply by not catching the disease and not spreading the disease. So in order for smallpox to come back, you had to get enough vulnerable people showing up that it could spread more easily between them. When the plague would come through, you would get a lot of hysteria, panic, fear. We didn't see this with smallpox. It wasn't a sudden invader coming in from outside. It was something relatively familiar. Adults had seen outbreaks in the past. Smallpox was what we call endemic. Endemic means established in a population with relatively common outbreaks. Well, it doesn't have to have the relatively common outbreaks to be considered endemic because, you know, I guess you could say that. Flu is endemic. The common cold is endemic. We have outbreaks of those periodically. So smallpox was endemic. This is a word I think a lot of people don't understand because we hear people saying, oh, COVID is endemic now. And okay, it is. But a lot of people seem to think that means that we don't have to worry about it anymore. It's here to stay, and that means it's not going to be as deadly or as dangerous, which is not true. Smallpox never got milder, even though it was in the human species for at least 5,000 years. In addition, we didn't have as much panic because the victims were primarily children. So the disease did not tend to leave widows and orphans. When the plague came through, it would leave a lot of widows and orphans. In addition, about half of people on the streets would have scars. So you walk down the street and about half the people had marks on their face to remind you about smallpox. You could never forget about it because it was always there. And during this time period, the 17th and 18th centuries, parents would sometimes seek out someone with a mild case and deliberately infect their children who had not been exposed, in the hopes that if this person has a mild case, maybe my child will have a minor case and be more likely to survive. Okay. So effects on society. I already talked about women on the marriage market. Sometimes women would get smallpox and their husbands would abandon them. During the 18th century, smallpox was the leading cause of blindness. In England, it was directly responsible for dynastic change. So this, in the early 1700s, the last heir of the House of Stuart died of smallpox. So the House of Stuart was the ruling party. They were the family that produced the kings and queens of England. Well, this caused a constitutional, let me see if I can, constitutional crisis. Nobody knew who would be the next king. These things are always uncomfortable time periods for a community. If you don't know who the next ruler is going to be, you don't have anybody in charge. This is incredibly stressful. Eventually, rule was transferred to the House of Hanover. So our modern day kings and queens of England are not descended from the same from the people who were kings and queens of Europe during the 1600s. All right. I think we're going to stop there because the next thing I want to talk about is when smallpox came to the Americas. And this is a pretty big story, so I don't want to get started on it and quit halfway through. Does anybody have any questions of what we went over today?
I'm all set.
Okay. In that case, I hope you don't have bad dreams about smallpox. Something to be thankful for that we don't have anymore. And I will see everybody on Thursday.
Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
Bye.
All right, thank you.
Great day.
Bye.